The Auburn Tigers are also a team that is poised for a breakout here in this upcoming season. Now, you look at where they were last year. They were an awful lot better than their final record would probably indicate. You look at the 5-7 record, you're thinking, well, you are what your record says you are. That's not true. There are some 5-7 teams I couldn't wait to play, and there were other 5-7 teams who were like, we better be buttoned up today, boys, because these guys can get us. Auburn falls into the latter category because while from an efficiency standpoint, from an explosiveness standpoint, they were one of the best in the SEC last year. The problem is they collapsed upon themselves like a dying star when they got in the red zone, and they had a real bad tendency early in the season to turn the football over. They were 119th in turnover margin last year. That was -6. They were 109th in red zone efficiency offensively last year. That's not good. And they were also dead last in field goal percentage, just 54% made. So there were a lot of things that were problematic last year, but if you look at the games, let's go game by game. I said 5-7, right? They were really competitive in most of their games. And I know close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. I get that. But if you look at Cal, how often are you -5 in the turnover margin and lose by one possession? That doesn't happen very often. How about Arkansas? When for the second time in 3 games, they turned the ball over 5 times and still had that game within striking distance up until the very end. They ended up losing it by 10, and they turned it over 5 times. So in a 3-game span, they turned it over 12 times. They were 1-2 in the process. Those 2 losses were by a combined 17 points. They also lost to Oklahoma 27-21. They threw a pick 6 in that game up and really gave up 2 big plays offensively, 1 long quarterback run and 1 long throw down the right sideline. So that game was one that they had control of and made a critical error at the end that gave Oklahoma the win. And then they lost to Georgia. You're going to look at the final score. You're going to say, well, it was 31-13. That's not competitive. Yeah, but that game was a 1-score game with Auburn at the 50-yard line before they botched a 4th-and-1 exchange that led to a turnover on downs and ultimately the dam breaking for Hugh Freeze and the Auburn Tigers. The good news is they went out, and I think they had a really strong offseason on the recruiting trail. To be coming off of 5-7 and really consecutive disappointing seasons, to have this type of haul in recruiting should be pretty optimistic and should hopefully give them a little momentum. They signed 26 players out of high school, but they added 16 in the transfer portal, which is where most people are formulating a lot of their optimism. They brought in Jackson Arnold, who was from Oklahoma, was the starting quarterback at Oklahoma. But the reason why Jackson Arnold was the starting quarterback at Oklahoma last year is because the staff felt better about his upside than Dylan Gabriel, who ended up going to Oregon to become a Heisman Trophy finalist and the leader of a team that went on to win the Big Ten in their first year in the league. So think about that. Dylan Gabriel was there in Norman, prepared to be the starting quarterback, but the staff felt, you know what, we're probably better served having Jackson Arnold for a handful of years, so we'll go with the younger player and allow the older player to find a new home. That is the type of player that Jackson Arnold was going into last year. Now, can he get back some of that confidence that was clearly lost in the bowl game the year before, where he threw 3 interceptions against Arizona, where he turned the ball over like crazy throughout the spring, turned the ball over like crazy throughout fall camp, and then that carried over into the fall, where he made some mistakes and was ultimately benched against the Tennessee Volunteers. Can Jackson Arnold get back to being the 5-star player that he was in high school? Or is he going to have to resort to becoming more of the grinder that he was down the stretch last season? Because he did end up retaking the starting job. And at that point, they didn't really put him in as many, difficult situations as a passer. They really went and said, all right, Jackson, what do you do best at this point of your development? Well, let's run the football. He had 116 carries last year. And you're going to look, and if you look the numbers up, you'll see 150. Well, know that 34 of those 150 were actually sacks. So he had 116 carries last year and was awfully productive when running the football. And if you look at his last 5 games against Power 5 competition, he had at least 17 carries in each of the last 5 games against Power 5 teams. So they basically said, Jackson, we don't trust you right now to drop back and find an open receiver, but we do trust you to carry the football. And I think that will be part of what they ask him to do at Auburn as well. At wide receiver, if you believe it or not, the most disappointing position maybe in the last 25 years at Auburn football has been the wide receiver spot. They have yet to have a receiver go over 1,000 yards this century. The last one was Ronnie Daniels. He had 1,068 yards in 1999. So let's just say this, they're due. Keandre Lambert-Smith almost got there last year, had just over 950, but this might be the season with the two pieces they really like. They're in their arsenal at wide receiver. Eric Singleton transfers over from Georgia Tech. He has long been utilized as a deep threat, but I think there's more in the tank there as far as being a down-in, down-out wide receiver. He can catch and run. He can do the screens. He can get behind the defense, but I also think he can win on the intermediates. He just hasn't really been utilized like that at this stage of his career. And then Cam Coleman, who is big and physical and really came on down the stretch last season and has shown that he can be a number one guy here going into his sophomore year. On paper, you also have to feel pretty good about some of their additions along the offensive line. Go out and get tackles from Virginia Tech, from USC, and that might be a group along the front that could be significantly upgraded from where they were a year ago. The big question mark for Auburn this year is what do they do at running back, which kind of leads me, like I said, I think Jackson Arnold's going to be a big part of what they are in the run game. I expect him to run the ball. They went out and took 2 transfer quarterbacks, which only further indicates that they're going to be willing to run Jackson Arnold throughout the season, because if he gets banged up, they now have an additional veteran that started games last year in college football to back him up. So I think Jackson Arnold is going to run it a lot, but they got to find out who the running back's going to be. Who's going to be the top guy for them? I think they have a bunch of solid running back options, but they don't have that true bell cow like they had the last couple of years in Jarquez Hunter. So him being gone is a considerable loss. So if they can identify who's going to take those carries, that'd be huge for the prospects of their run game offensively. On paper, defensively, you got to like what they were last year. They were 31st in the country in total defense. You're going to sit there and say, well, that's not great. Yeah, but it's not bad. If you look at some of the teams they had to play and some of the offenses they had to defend, 31st on defense isn't that bad. They were 28th in scoring defense. They were 27th in rushing defense. And if you look at their personnel, it's really not too bad. Now they have to replace about half their guys that played more than 200 snaps, which will not be an easy task, but I'm pretty optimistic about what they have on defense. I like their structure. I like their personnel. And some of the young guys that got extended minutes down the stretch, those guys are going to be well positioned to take a big leap, like DeMarcus Riddick at the second level, number 16, their off-the-ball linebacker. A couple key games for them. It's always pretty obvious what their key games are, right? You know Bama games at the end of the year. You know the Georgia games at some point in October. So those 2 games are both at home this year. It is an odd year, meaning odd number, 25, which means Auburn gets both those games at home. Those are the years, those odd years have been the years when they've had a little bit more success. They're also at Oklahoma. They're also at Texas A&M. So I think the schedule's tough, but I don't think it's impossible. I'm telling you, I think we could fast forward to the end of the year and we could be talking about Auburn as one of those dark horse teams that if they get hot at the right time, they could definitely spoil some seasons and potentially get into the college football playoff conversation.